Night of June 5th, 1944. Over the dim airfields of southern England, the hum of engines stitched the darkness together like a living thread. RAF ground crews moved beneath the wings of Halifax and Stirling bombers, their boots echoing on wet tarmac, their gloved hands guiding the silver outlines of canisters into open bomb bays. But these were no ordinary payloads, no high-explosive ordnance or incendiaries meant to burn cities. The cargo this night did not breathe, did not speak, did not bleed. Each figure was a grotesque imitation of a man. Burlap skin stuffed with straw, wooden limbs hinged by wire, parachutes folded with mock precision. The crews called them Ruperts, scarecrows wearing khaki. To touch them was to feel the weight of absurdity that war had come to this, to dropping ghosts from the sky. In the ready rooms before takeoff, the briefings were concise and clinical. The maps spread beneath. Red lamps showed strange coordinates. Fields near. Cotentin, orchards west of Cayenne, crossroads between Carentan and Saint-Lô. These were not strategic targets, but stages in a vast theatre of illusion. The operation's code name was TITANIC, one fragment of a deception mosaic called FORTITUDE, the invisible half of the Normandy invasion. The task was simple to describe and perilous to execute: make the enemy believe an army was landing where none existed. Each drop, the squadron leader had told his men, is worth a battalion of confusion. That was the arithmetic of deception. Every false parachute meant a platoon diverted. Every flicker of gunfire on a sound beacon meant a division held in reserve too long. The pilots and navigators understood the grim humour behind the mission men dropping men that weren't men, killing with mathematics rather than bullets. By 2300 hours, the first bombers taxied out. Overhead, the clouds hung low, brushing the rotating beacons like smoke over a dying fire. Engines roared, one by one, until the airfield itself trembled. The smell of fuel and cordite mingled with the damp English night. A mechanic named Sergeant Wilkes stood beside the runway, wiping his hands on a rag as the first Halifax began its roll. He had loaded Ruperts all evening, straw torsos, wooden heads, little charges meant to set them aflame on landing. "They'll burn like real ones," he muttered. "Maybe Jerry'll count bodies that aren't there." At altitude, the world below disappeared into fog and starlight. The channel was a black sheet stitched with reflections of moonlight. Inside the cockpit, dim red lamps lit the navigator's charts. They followed bearings toward the French coast, toward radar echoes and phantom armadas. Across the entire channel front, operations GLIMMER and TAXABLE were beginning small fleets of motor launches trailing metallic chaff called window to create radar signatures of non-existent invasion forces. On the German screens along the Pas-de-Calais, two entire amphibious armadas seemed to crawl across the sea. Somewhere in the night sky above, other aircraft dropped more window, clouds of tinfoil strips drifting like metallic snow, multiplying false reflections. This was war by illusion, and its soldiers were shadows. At 0130 hours, the first Ruperts dropped. From the open hatches, crewmen watched the strange paratroopers tumble into the darkness, their parachutes blooming pale against the night. Each figure carried a small, timed explosive device camouflage No. 15, designed to ignite the dummy on impact, mimicking the flashes of rifle fire or grenades. The sight was both absurd and haunting. Hundreds of false men floated down in silence, the wind tugging their cloth limbs. Below, German sentries near Valognes and Yvetot looked up to see what they thought was a massive airborne assault. Machine guns opened fire into the dark. Somewhere, alarm bells clanged. The deception began to work. Reports flowed into German headquarters through the early morning. Enemy parachutists landing south of Cherbourg. Multiple drops near the Orne River. Engagement with airborne troops near Coutances. Each report contradicted the next, yet all pointed to a nightmare, an invasion everywhere at once. The 7th Army commander, General Friedrich Dollmann, demanded confirmation. None came, but every minute spent doubting was a minute the real paratroopers. the men of the 6th Airborne Division landed unopposed east of the Orne. Meanwhile, the bombers turned for home. In their empty bays, the air vibrated with echoes of what had been dropped: straw, wire, cloth, and imagination. The wireless operators monitored snippets of the false radio chatter being broadcast by special squadrons' recorded commands, clipped British accents ordering non-existent platoons to assemble and attack. The sound of a war that did not exist drifted through the ether. In a farmhouse near Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte, a German sergeant named Kurt Meinhold later wrote in his diary that he saw hundreds of parachutes in the sky that night. His men fired until their barrels glowed. By dawn, they had found only fragments of canvas and smouldering straw. "We thought it was a trick," he wrote, "but we could not be sure. The enemy had ghosts." Back in England, at Operations Headquarters in Portsmouth, officers from the Royal Air Force and Special Air Service traced the results on situation maps. Reports from ultra-intercepts confirmed that German units were on the move. Panzer Lehr, elements of the 91st Air Landing Division dispatched toward phantom landings. The deception was working far beyond expectation. What had begun as a desperate improvisation, straw and canvas in place of soldiers, was now bending the enemy's perception of the battlefield itself. The irony was not lost on those who planned it. The men who dropped the Ruperts were veterans of real bombing campaigns: Hamburg, Essen, Cologne. They had watched cities burn from 30,000 feet. Yet this mission, bloodless and absurd, might save more lives than 100 raids. In a war defined by production and destruction, the Allies had turned imagination into a weapon. As dawn crept over the Channel, the bombers returned. Their wheels touched the wet runways slick with morning mist. Ground crews swarmed around them, counting bullet holes, checking fuel lines. The air smelled of oil and victory deferred. A radio operator handed his squadron leader the first intercept of the morning, a German situation report claiming large-scale enemy airborne operation near Avranches. The officer read it twice, then smiled. "Good," he said. "They're chasing shadows." In the debriefing hut, one of the pilots scrawled a line in his logbook: "Dropped 50 Ruperts. No losses. Enemy believed." Another wrote simply, "Best night of the war. The fields of Normandy were now littered with charred remnants of men who never lived." Some dummies hung from trees, their straw spilling like entrails. Others burned quietly in the hedgerows, their parachutes fluttering like shrouds. To a farmer waking at dawn, it must have looked as if an army of scarecrows had fallen from heaven. Above them, the real war thundered westward: the fleets, the paratroopers, the long columns of landing craft that would change the world. But before them came the shadows, the milk bottles in the dark, the ghosts who walked ahead of history to make the path a little less deadly for the living. And so began the greatest invasion of the modern age, not with bullets or bayonets, but with silence, straw, and imagination. The night belonged to the phantoms. The dawn would belong to the men who followed them. Dawn crept pale and shivering over the English Channel on June 6, 1944. At airfields from Lincolnshire to Sussex, the hangars stood hollow, the night's noise, replaced by the quiet rasp of pencils scratching mission logs. Those who had flown the deception sorties returned to find the war already moving beyond them, to beaches, to hedgerows, to the long grey morning where real men fell. Yet their work, though unseen, had already begun to shape the battle. The Ruperts, as the aircrews called them, were no mere curiosities of subterfuge. Each one was the culmination of months of engineering conducted under the dull fluorescent lights of secret workshops across Britain. Their official designation read: Device, Camouflage, No. 15, Parachute Dummy, Type Rupert. They were manufactured by hand, rough, ungainly, and morbidly comic in workshops in Essex and Wiltshire, packed in wooden crates, stamped with codes that revealed nothing. The artisans who built them were told only that they were helping to save lives. Each dummy stood roughly 5 feet high, weighing scarcely more than 40 pounds, a stuffed Hessian body, crude, wooden head, straw arms and legs, and a parachute made from scrap silk, The illusion was meant only for the sky, a silhouette in the dark, not a man in daylight. In the chest cavity sat a small charge of thermite or phosphorus, the self-destruct device that would ignite on impact. When the dummy touched ground, it flared like a soldier, firing or dying. The purpose was psychological, not physical. To mimic life just long enough to provoke fear. British deception officers joked grimly that they were building straw men for the world's greatest performance. But the calculations behind them were anything but whimsical. For weeks before D-Day, analysts at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force SHAEF had studied German reaction times, radio procedures, and troop movements. From these, they developed an equation. If the enemy believed in a major airborne landing behind the lines, he would hold or divert forces for at least 6 hours. 6 hours, the fragile window needed for the real landings on the Normandy coast to dig in. The operations planners at the Air Ministry gave it a mythic name, Operation TITANIC, subdivided into 4 parts, TITANIC I through IV. Each drop zone was carefully chosen to intersect known German observation routes. TITANIC I would deploy near Yvetot, TITANIC II near the Cotentin Peninsula, TITANIC III east of Caen, and TITANIC IV along the Vire River Valley. In total, more than 500 dummy parachutists would fall that night, escorted by a handful of real Special Air Service men, small teams, dropped to amplify the illusion with recorded gunfire and radio chatter. At RAF Tempsford, the pilots of No. 138 and No. 161 squadrons received their orders in clipped tones. These were veteran crews, specialists in clandestine operations, the same men who had dropped agents of the Special Operations Executive into occupied Europe. They knew what it meant to fly low and alone. On June 5th, they carried a stranger company, straw soldiers and phantom paratroopers. Flying at less than 1,000 feet, often beneath the radar screen's reach, they released their cargo into the pre-dawn murk. Some planes dropped sound beacons, nicknamed pintails, compact phonograph devices that played pre-recorded rifle and mortar fire for up to 30 minutes. Others released window, those shimmering strips of aluminum foil that painted radar scopes with the illusion of dense airborne formations. The results defied expectation. By 2 a.m, German field telephones along the Cotentin crackled with reports of parachute drops in every direction. Fallschirmjäger north of Saint-Lô, one message read. Enemy paratroops in the Forêt de Cérisy, claimed another. A panzer division near Avranches was ordered to move immediately to counterattack. At Saint-Lô itself, an entire battalion of the 91st Air Landing Division deployed against a forest, full of burning straw. One German corporal, writing in a letter later found by Allied intelligence, described hundreds of parachutes descending like ghosts. They burned upon landing, leaving behind strange remains, fabric sacks, pieces of rope, the smell of smoke. Another report, filed by the 7th Army's operations officer at 3:30 hours, declared that enemy airborne forces have landed in great strength near Coutances. Countermeasures underway. The illusion spread like contagion. Each false report reinforced another, until the German command chain trembled with conflicting alarms. In the fog of the early hours, the phantom invasion appeared larger than the real one, but the dummies alone were not enough. Alongside them, small detachments of living men moved silently through the field's real commandos amid their straw counterparts. These were the Special Air Service teams attached to TITANIC. Their orders were clear. Land among the Ruperts, play, recordings of gunfire, and broadcast fake signals as if an entire brigade had landed. They carried portable loudspeakers powered by car batteries, and in the darkness they triggered them, filling the night with shouted commands and the rattle of machine guns. German troops converging on the area fired blindly, convinced they were under attack by hundreds. Corporal George Jock Fraser, one of the SAS men, would later write that we were 6 men pretending to be 600. His group, TITANIC IV, landed near Marigny. They set up their decoys, planted the sound equipment, and fought a brief skirmish with German patrols. 2 of his men were captured. The others slipped back toward Allied lines, leaving the illusion intact. By dawn, the full magnitude of the deception was visible only to those who planned it. The German 7th Army had spent the night chasing ghosts, diverting units that might have reinforced Carentan or Cayenne. The Luftwaffe scrambled sorties over empty skies, burning precious fuel to intercept dummies. In the calculus of war, every gallon wasted, every battalion misdirected, was victory without blood. When the morning sun rose over Normandy, farmers in the Orne Valley awoke to a strange harvest. Scattered across their fields lay scorched fragments of straw and canvas, parachutes tangled in hedgerows, and silent mockeries of men faces painted with crude expressions, uniforms stitched from burlap. They looked both comic and tragic, relics of some surreal battle fought by puppets. Later, Allied intelligence would estimate that Operation TITANIC caused at least 9 separate German battalions to be redeployed and delayed the arrival of armoured reinforcements at the beaches by critical hours. To the strategists, this was proof of success. To the men who had dropped the Ruperts, it was something stranger, a victory made of emptiness. In the mess hall that evening, one of the pilots from 138 Squadron raised a mug of tea and said quietly, "We dropped ghosts last night." Another replied, "Aye, and they fought better than we did." Outside, the wind stirred through the grass beside the runway, whispering through the scattered scraps of parachute silk that had drifted home on the night breeze. The phantoms had done their work. The deception had lived its brief life and burned out in the fields of France, but in those few hours of darkness, it had rewritten the balance of the war, a reminder that even in the age of steel and fire, imagination remained the most unpredictable weapon of all. Midnight over the Channel, June 5th to 6th, 1944. While the Ruperts tumbled into Norman fields, another illusion was already taking shape, far out to sea, one made not of straw and burlap, but of radar echoes and reflected light. Along the cold waters east of Dover and off Cap d'Antifer, small convoys of British motor launches and torpedo boats began their slow, deliberate crawl toward the French coast. They moved not in silence, but in orchestration, switching searchlights, releasing aluminum foil, and broadcasting radio chatter from non-existent fleets. Their operation names were as improbable as the deception itself: GLIMMER and TAXABLE. Together, they formed the other half of the night's mirage. The theory behind it was elegant, almost mathematical. German coastal radar systems, the Würzburg and Freya arrays, were precise but predictable. Their operators judged invasion fleets by the movement of bright patches crawling across cathode tubes. If those patches could be mimicked, then a few dozen small boats might appear as hundreds of ships. British scientists and naval officers had spent months studying how to fake those signatures, measuring every pulse of reflected energy, every flicker of ghostly movement. By 2300 hours, the deception flotillas were in motion. The vessels of Operation TAXABLE, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Arthur A. Johnson, steamed off Cap d'Antifer, their decks stacked high with bundles of window-thin strips of aluminum foil cut to precise half-wavelengths of German radar frequencies. Every minute, the crews released bundles by hand, feeding them into the wind so they fell like metallic snow over the water. As the waves carried the foil outward, German radar stations began to bloom with false echoes. What had been an empty sea suddenly glowed with what looked like a massive armada moving toward Le Havre. 100 miles to the northeast, Operation Glimmer was unfolding in parallel. Motor launches from the Royal Navy's 19th Flotilla crept toward Boulogne. They, too, fed aluminum chaff into the night air, guided by the carefully plotted speed and heading that would make the Phantom Fleet appear to approach land at dawn. Each boat followed a precise navigation pattern: 8 knots, turn 2 degrees every 10 minutes, maintain spacing by radio beacon, so that, to German radar, their collective movements traced the shape of a true invasion convoy. Onshore, the deception began to take hold. German operators near Calais watched in disbelief as radar screens filled with blips the size of capital ships. Telephones rang in command bunkers. Reports travelled up the chain to the 15th Army headquarters at Saint-Omer, where officers had been primed by weeks of false intelligence from Operation Fortitude South, the great deception that had convinced Berlin the main Allied invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Now the evidence seemed to confirm it. Fleets approaching Calais, airborne landings reported near the Seine. Everything pointed north, exactly as the Allies intended. The German coastal batteries waited. At Cap Grisnez, the gunners of the 266th Naval Artillery Regiment manned their 155mm guns, scanning the horizon for shapes. But there were none to see. The sea was dark and empty, except for the faint glow of British searchlights and the flicker of star shells fired at the sky. The batteries opened fire anyway, their shells plunging harmlessly into the water. The fleet they targeted did not exist. On board the British launches, sailors watched the explosions with grim amusement. One petty officer aboard ML 584 later recalled, "It was like being haunted by our own invention. You could almost see the ghosts of ships between us." Each time the German gunners fired, the deception deepened. Radar operators interpreted the artillery response as confirmation that an invasion was underway. Orders went out to deploy reserve divisions along the Calais sector. Tanks rumbled toward phantom beaches. Behind the facade of radar and gunfire, a handful of British aircraft added another layer to the illusion. Flying low over the Channel, squadrons of Lancaster and Stirling bombers released their own window, sweeping back and forth along precise tracks to simulate the radar profile of waves of landing craft. Their wireless operators transmitted rehearsed traffic, convoy codes, call signs, navigational chatter, all logged by German signals intelligence as genuine. In some areas, the bombers dropped small wooden rafts fitted with reflectors, drifting beacons that further cluttered the radar screens. By 2 a.m, the deception had reached full bloom. To the German command at Calais, the picture was unmistakable. 2 large invasion fleets closing in from the north. Orders from Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters instructed the 15th Army to prepare for attack. Reserve armour units were held back from Normandy, waiting for the main assault that would never come. The cost of these illusions was measured in gallons of fuel, hours of preparation, and nerves stretched thin. The crews of the small craft endured the same dangers as those in real combat zones: coastal artillery, E-boat patrols, drifting, mines. One motor launch, ML 559, was hit by a near miss that shattered her bridge and wounded 2 men. They continued the mission regardless. By dawn, their fuel nearly gone, the flotilla turned back toward England under radio silence. At 6:30 in the morning, as the first waves of Allied troops were storming the real beaches at Utah and Omaha, German radar still showed the phantom fleets hovering off Calais. Reports continued for hours. Even by midday, when the illusion had long dispersed, the German 17th Army remained convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversion. The deception had done its work. The enemy was fighting shadows. Back at Dover, Commander Johnson stood on the pier watching the returning boats. Their decks were littered with empty chaff boxes, their crews bleary-eyed but grinning. "We made the Channel glow," one sailor said. In a sense, he was right. The night had belonged to light, artificial, reflected, refracted, and to the Channel, human capacity to weaponize imagination. Historians would later describe GLIMMER and TAXABLE as minor footnotes in the vast orchestration of D-Day, but for those who had lived them, they were proof that illusion could be as powerful as armor. The Channel that night was filled not with ships of steel, but with ships of light fleets that never were, sailing across the screens of an enemy who could no longer tell the difference between what was real and what was made to be believed. The British sailors packed away their last bundles of window, leaving the decks slick with foil and seawater. In the east, the sun broke through the mist, turning the ocean to silver. Behind them, the coastline of France smouldered under the thunder of real invasion, but that morning, for a few precious hours, ghosts had ruled the Channel. By the summer of 1944, the British war effort had grown a second, invisible army, an army that fought not with rifles or tanks but with ideas, illusions, and calculated deceit. Its headquarters did not stand on a battlefield but in a Georgian townhouse at number 54, Broadway, London, behind a nondescript door bearing the name Office of Special Projects. The men who worked there called it, half in jest, the Ministry of Imagination. Officially, it was the London Controlling Section LCS, the nerve centre of Allied deception. From those cramped rooms, an entire universe of shadows was spun into being: inflatable tanks, rubber landing craft, dummy airfields, fake wireless transmissions, and paper armies staffed by clerks who had never fired a shot, all orchestrated into a performance of grand theatre designed to mislead the most formidable intelligence machine in Europe, the German High Command. It was from this place that operations FORTITUDE, GLIMMER, TAXABLE, and TITANIC were conceived, each one a layer in a grand illusion culminating on the night of June 5, 1944. The guiding hand behind it all was Colonel John Henry Bevan, a quiet, bespectacled officer with the unhurried diction of a barrister. A veteran of the First World War and a lawyer by trade, Bevan possessed an unlikely combination of precision and mischief. "Our task," he once told a junior officer, "is to make the enemy believe something so completely that he acts upon it. When he acts upon it, he's already lost." Bevan and his staff did not simply invent lies, they built entire ecosystems of credibility around them. In the months before D-Day, they constructed an imaginary army, the first U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, commanded, fittingly, by General George S. Patton, whose fiery reputation and recent removal from active command made him the perfect decoy. Through a complex web of false radio traffic, dummy installations in Kent, and even staged photographs of Patton inspecting his troops, the illusion became self-sustaining. German aerial reconnaissance confirmed what they expected to see: endless camps, supply dumps, and amphibious vehicles lining the southeastern coast of England. Every detail mattered. Fuel depots were built from canvas and scaffolding, their drums painted shadows onto tarmac. Dummy landing craft were moored in estuaries, shifting on the tide to imitate the motion of heavy boats. Even the roads were used as props. Convoys of trucks loaded with empty crates drove in endless loops to simulate logistical build-up. German agents, those few still believed loyal, were quietly fed with corroborating reports through the double-cross system, Britain's secret network of turned spies. One of those double agents, the Spaniard Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, was the masterpiece of deception. Through carefully crafted messages to his German handlers, Garbo maintained the illusion of a vast intelligence network operating inside Britain. His fictitious agents sent reports so detailed and consistent that Berlin considered him one of their most reliable sources. It was Garbo's network that reinforced the idea that the true invasion would strike at Calais long after Normandy had begun. On the night of June 5th, as RAF bombers carried Ruperts across the Channel and motor launches released chaff into the wind, the men and women of LCS gathered around teleprinters in their candle-lit offices. They listened as decrypted German signals came in through Bletchley Park, evidence that the deception was taking root. Reports from Calais to Berlin described sightings of invasion fleets, paratroopers near Yvetot, and heavy landings north of the Seine. One clerk, a young WAAF named Margaret Vaughan, remembered the moment she realized it was working. "We weren't soldiers," she said years later. "We were magicians. We'd made the enemy fight smoke." The artistry of deception lay not only in creation but in timing. Too much falsehood, and the illusion collapsed. Too little, and suspicion crept in. LCS worked with the precision of engineers, ensuring that every signal, every reconnaissance photo, every rumour supported a unified narrative. A deception plan, they liked to say, was like a bridge strong only if every beam held. The effects of their work rippled far beyond the English coast. When the Allied invasion of Normandy began, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, refused to release his armoured reserves. He believed the Normandy attack to be a diversion, a feint preceding the real invasion at Calais. Hitler himself shared this belief, reinforced by Garbo's urgent messages claiming that FUSAG was still preparing to strike. For 7 crucial weeks until late July, the panzer divisions that might have driven the Allies into the sea remained immobilized around Calais, guarding a coastline against ghosts. Bevan's ministry operated with an unusual sense of detachment from glory. Their successes were measured in inaction, the number of enemy units that failed to move, the hours gained before counterattack, the confusion spreading through enemy reports. In the war's ledgers, they were barely a footnote, yet their fingerprints lay across every major Allied operation after 1942, Torch in North Africa, Husky in Sicily, and finally Overlord in France. One afternoon, in August 1944, after Paris had been liberated, Bevan was seen standing by the window of his office, watching the sunlight reflect on the Thames. A secretary entered with a decoded message. 15th Army reports continued expectation of attack on Calais. Bevan smiled faintly. "They're still waiting," he murmured. "Let them wait." The deception had outlived its purpose. The shadow armies were quietly dismantled. Inflatable tanks deflated into tarpaulin husks. The radio operators packed up their sets. The Ruperts, the dummy ships, the wooden airfields, all relics of a war that had used imagination as ammunition, were consigned to storage depots and forgotten barns. Years later, when historians tried to trace the origin of Fortitude and its web of illusions, they discovered that few of the participants had ever met each other. Some had been pilots, others naval officers, others mere painters and set designers from London's theatres. The deception was not the work of a single genius, but of a nation that had learned to think like a trickster, where architects built fake runways, artists painted shadow armies, and engineers designed straw paratroopers that burned like men. In the end, the Ministry of Imagination achieved what no weapon could. It persuaded the enemy to believe precisely what the Allies wanted him to. And in that belief so carefully seeded, so meticulously nurtured, lay the quiet victory that made the thunder of D-Day possible. It was, as one officer later called it, a masterpiece of make-believe, a war fought with shadows, where the truth marched behind illusions, and the fate of Europe turned upon the work of men, who made the unreal seem utterly, devastatingly real. In the winter of 1943, long before the Ruperts, the radar ghosts, or the phantom fleets, the Allies had agreed upon a single doctrine. Deception would be treated not as an accessory to war, but as a weapon. The name chosen for the doctrine was both ironic and prophetic, Operation Bodyguard, after Winston Churchill's remark that, in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. Bodyguard was not a single plan, but an umbrella under which all other illusions would unfold. From it descended Fortitude in the north, Zeppelin in the Mediterranean, and later GLIMMER, TAXABLE, and TITANIC, each one a limb of a larger, deliberate falsehood. Its aim was audacious in scope, to conceal the time and place of the coming invasion of Western Europe, to stretch the German defences thin, and to keep them guessing long after the true landings had begun. At its heart was a simple premise: make the enemy believe that what he fears most is exactly what is happening. Intelligence officers called it mirror logic. Hold up the enemy's own expectations and let him see himself reflected in them. By 1943, German intelligence had become convinced that the Allies would invade the Pas-de-Calais. The region offered the shortest crossing from Dover, direct rail access to the interior of France, and strong existing port facilities. It was, by every military standard, the logical choice. Bodyguard's architects decided to give the Germans exactly what they wanted to believe. The execution required coordination across every Allied command theatre. The deception began in Moscow, where fake diplomatic telegrams and staged photographs hinted at an Allied commitment to launch an invasion in Scandinavia, an operation that never existed. In the Mediterranean, false troop movements in Algeria and Egypt suggested attacks toward Greece and the Balkans. German intercepts dutifully logged them all, believing they were reading stolen secrets rather than planted fiction. In Britain, the deception became art. Bevan's London controlling section coordinated with the 20 Committee, the XX system that managed all known German agents in the country, each one turned and reporting now to MI5. Through them flowed an intricate tapestry of lies, train movements, supply manifests, and overheard military gossip, all describing preparations for a Calais assault under General Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group. The reports were consistent, detailed, and utterly false. At the same time, the Allies weaponized technology. Radio deception units, staffed by linguists and engineers, simulated the traffic of entire divisions. Operators rotated through scripted transmissions that mirrored real army logistics, weather briefings, fuel requests, ordnance deliveries. German signals analysts, listening from occupied France, charted the apparent build-up with satisfaction. To them, the picture of a massive army forming in southeast England seemed undeniable. Bodyguard also extended into the psychological realm. In neutral Sweden and Spain, diplomats and businessmen, some real, others recruited for the purpose, whispered about Allied invasion timetables. Controlled leaks were delivered to journalists and couriers known to have German contacts. Even the weather was manipulated. Reconnaissance flights were reduced over Normandy, but increased over Calais, encouraging Luftwaffe analysts to assume that Allied interest lay in the latter. To maintain the illusion, truth itself had to be disguised. Real troop convoys bound for the west were scheduled at night, while daytime rail movements featured empty trains heading toward the southeast. Soldiers assigned to dummy camps were instructed to write letters home mentioning Kent, Dover, and Folkestone locations carefully monitored by German censors. Nothing was left to chance. Even rumour became a weapon. By May of 1944, the bodyguard of lies was complete. Allied leaders knew that Germany expected a Calais assault, and they ensured every signal reinforced that belief. On June 6, when the first landings hit Normandy, the deception did not end, it intensified. Garbo's radio network sent urgent messages warning that Normandy was merely a diversion, that the real invasion under Patton was imminent. Hitler believed it. He ordered panzer divisions near Calais to hold their positions. For 50 critical days, the strongest German formations waited for an enemy that would never come. When the truth finally dawned, it was too late. The Allies had established a beachhead, liberated Cherbourg, and begun the breakout toward Paris. Bodyguard had done its work, an operation so vast and subtle that it altered the shape of the war itself. In the years after, when its details were declassified, one intelligence officer reflected on its paradox. We deceived them, not by being cleverer than they were, but by being predictable. We gave them the war they expected. It was the ultimate irony. The greatest act of imagination in modern warfare was built on giving the enemy exactly what he wanted to believe. Bodyguard's success ensured that D-Day's victory was not won only on the beaches of Normandy, but also in the minds of men, where lies, crafted with precision and faith, became the deadliest truth of all. By the time summer deepened over occupied Europe in 1944, deception had become a parallel campaign, a war of phantoms that marched in step with the armies of men. From the windswept beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, falsehood had become as potent as artillery. The Germans still saw ghosts on their maps, phantom fleets off Calais, non-existent paratroopers near Le Havre, imaginary divisions gathering in Kent. What had begun as individual operations, Bodyguard, Fortitude, Titanic, GLIMMER had fused into something larger, a continuous theatre of illusion. The German command, already fractured by competing personalities and Hitler's mercurial interference, had been lured into a labyrinth of misjudgment. In July, as Allied armour broke through the hedgerows of Normandy, the 15th Army still guarded Calais, certain that Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group would soon strike across the Channel. Reports from Abwehr agents, carefully fed by MI5, described the imminent departure of the Calais invasion fleet. Even as real Allied divisions were driving toward Paris, the Germans awaited reinforcements that existed only on paper. At Bletchley Park, British codebreakers read these reports with quiet satisfaction. Ultra-decrypts of Enigma traffic showed that the deception had taken on a life of its own. German commanders no longer needed fresh lies, they supplied them to each other. One message from Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters to Berlin, intercepted on July 29th, read, "Enemy concentrations opposite Calais remain considerable. We anticipate renewed invasion attempt within the fortnight." The message was pure illusion, yet it fixed German armour in place while the Allies advanced. By August, the deceptionists had begun planning the next act. The Normandy landings had succeeded. Now the task was to prevent the enemy from reorganizing his defences along the Seine and Rhine. A new Operation Ferdinand extended the artifice into southern France. Its purpose was to disguise the true landing site of Operation Dragoon by suggesting a larger assault toward Genoa and the Balkans. Once again, a handful of radio operators, artists, and cryptographers created the impression of armies where none existed. They had become masters of order of battle fiction, drafting imaginary unit rosters complete with insignia, logistics, and casualty returns. The deception campaign had evolved beyond tactics, it had become culture. Camouflage officers who once painted trucks in khaki now painted shadows onto airfields, tracing fake tire marks across runways. Engineers constructed dummy oil tanks from canvas stretched over wooden frames. Soldiers of the Royal Engineers staged mock construction projects visible from German reconnaissance aircraft, their bulldozers scraping patterns designed to mimic fortifications. Each illusion was a note in the symphony of falsehood. Within the German command, confusion hardened into paranoia. Hitler's staff began to suspect that Allied intelligence had penetrated their most trusted channels, and they were right. The Abwehr, once a proud intelligence service, was now riddled with British-controlled agents. Reports of enemy landings were dismissed as maskirovka, a word borrowed from the Russian lexicon of deceit. But this skepticism came too late. By then, the true power of deception was psychological. Every shadow on radar, every rumour in a French village, became potential truth. The Germans had been made to fear not just the enemy's strength, but his imagination. Among Allied planners, a quiet pride grew. Deception had become an invisible shield, absorbing enemy attention and dispersing it harmlessly across 1,000 false targets. The LCS compiled its final assessment that autumn. The German response time to Allied operations had been delayed by an average of 48 hours throughout the campaign. 48 hours in modern war, the margin between defeat and survival. When Paris was liberated in late August, many of the deception officers remained in London, their victories uncelebrated. They watched newsreels of cheering crowds and armoured columns, knowing their own triumphs would never be shown. For security, even the names of their operations remained classified. The Ministry of Imagination dissolved quietly, its members reassigned or demobilized, yet their influence endured. The final German offensive, the Ardennes, December 1944, would reveal how deeply deception had reshaped modern warfare. When Hitler launched his surprise counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge, Allied commanders at first dismissed it as a feint, an echo of their own methods turned against them. Deception had become universal, a dark mirror held up to both sides. In the ruins of Berlin a year later, Allied interrogators found among the captured files of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht a thick dossier titled Feindliche Täuschungsmaßnahmen, Enemy Deception Measures. Inside were detailed analyses of TITANIC, GLIMMER, and Bodyguard, compiled long after the damage was done. The final page bore a handwritten note, scrawled by a weary intelligence officer in blue pencil. "We did not lose to superior numbers. We lost to superior imagination." The war of shadows had ended, but it had already redefined the future. For every real battle fought with bullets and steel, another had been fought with ghosts, echoes, and the audacity to make men believe in what wasn't there. And in that invisible war, fought in the quiet rooms of London and the cold skies above France, the British commandos who once dropped fake cows and straw soldiers had proved something enduring. That imagination, when properly armed, could conquer even the most disciplined mind. Long before the straw men fell from the sky, before radar ghosts flickered across the channel, and before Calais bristled with phantom armies, the Deception War began in a quiet corner of the New Forest. The place was called Beaulieu, a manor house, and its surrounding farmland turned secret school for the Special Operations Executive. Locals knew it only as the farm. What grew there was not crops, but imagination made dangerous. By 1941, Beaulieu had become Britain's crucible for the improbable, a training ground for spies, saboteurs, and the first practitioners of organized deception. It was here that the earliest camouflage officers were sent to learn how to make the impossible look real. Painters from the Royal Academy lectured beside physicists and theatre set designers. Their classrooms smelled of turpentine, wet wool, and cordite. They were the artisans of illusion, men and women, who could turn a canvas sheet into a tank, a pile of logs into an airfield, a cow carcass into a hiding place for a radio set. Among them was a young officer from the Camouflage Development and Training Centre at Farnham Castle, Lieutenant Geoffrey Barkas, a filmmaker turned soldier. Before the war, Barkas had worked on adventure films in the Sahara. Now he applied his cinematic instincts to the problem of survival. He believed that deception was not simply camouflage, it was storytelling. Every lie must have continuity, he told his students. The enemy must believe the frame before he believes the picture. Beaulieu's instructors taught more than concealment. They trained minds to think sideways. One day's lecture might cover how to distort perspective with mirrors and shadows. The next, how to build a fake airfield complete with decoy runways made from crushed glass and painted oil stains. Students learned to rig vehicles with canvas shells, to scatter spore false tracks that led nowhere, and to compose radio traffic for imaginary units. They were told that success would mean remaining invisible, their names never recorded. By 1942, graduates of Beaulieu were serving across the Mediterranean theatre. In Egypt, Barkas and his camouflage directorate executed one of the first great battlefield illusions, the construction of a dummy army at El Alamein. Using 2,000 dummy vehicles and wooden artillery barrels, they convinced the Germans that the main British attack would come from the south, when in fact Montgomery's 8th Army struck in the north. The success of that deception convinced the High Command that illusion could change the outcome of campaigns. From there, the path led directly to Operation Bodyguard and the Grand Theatre of D-Day. Back at Beaulieu, the techniques grew ever more elaborate. Students practiced planting false parachutes in the woods, timing the release of sound effects from loudspeakers hidden in barns, and even crafting papier-mâché livestock that could conceal men or equipment. The fake cows, later immortalized in rumor, originated here, hollow frames covered in painted hide, designed to hide a radio operator or observer in a pasture. A handful of these absurd yet effective props would later be used along the French coast during reconnaissance operations, their eyes replaced by small glass lenses linked to cameras. Beaulieu became the crucible of quiet innovation. Engineers experimented with phosphorescent paint for night illusions, while psychologists analyzed how German soldiers reacted to stimuli like flares, engine sounds, or the sight of parachutes. Every lesson returned to the same principle. The human mind is the weakest armor. If you could shape perception, you could win battles without firing a shot. As the war turned toward its climax, the graduates of the farm scattered across Europe. Some joined the Royal Engineers camouflage units. Others joined the SOE and the newly formed SAS, applying deception behind enemy lines. Their fingerprints could be found in every theatre from the fake convoys off Crete to the straw men of Normandy. When the war ended, Beaulieu returned to pastoral quiet. The camouflage sheds were dismantled, and the classrooms were reclaimed by ivy and silence. Yet the legacy of the place endured. Its alumni went on to found the post-war black operations and psychological warfare schools that defined the Cold War era. In the village pub near Beaulieu, old instructors occasionally gathered in the late 1940s. One of them, a former stage designer, raised his glass one evening and said, "We made the war into theatre, and somehow theatre won." Today, Few remember that Britain's invisible army began not in factories or arsenals, but on a farm where art students, magicians, and soldiers learned that truth itself could be bent into a weapon. The fields of Beaulieu never grew wheat again, but they yielded something rarer, the harvest of imagination, reaped in a war where every shadow could be a soldier, and every lie, if told well enough, could save 1,000 lives. By the spring of 1945, the war of deception had become almost self-aware, a machine that ran on imagination and secrecy, now devouring its own myths. The shadows it cast had grown so intricate that even those who created them sometimes struggled to distinguish invention from memory. And yet, in those final months, when Allied armies crossed the Rhine and the Reich began to crumble, deception still fought quietly in the background, guarding routes, masking troop movements, and ensuring that the final blows struck where the enemy least expected. In March, under grey skies and relentless rain, the British 21st Army Group prepared to cross the Rhine in Operation Plunder. Once again, illusion was called to serve. Engineers of the Royal Engineers Camouflage Section and veterans of Beaulieu's farm went to work along the riverbanks. They built dummy pontoon bridges from canvas stretched over scaffolding, complete with reflections painted onto the water using oil slicks and mirror fragments. Inflatable boats lined the shore hollow shapes that looked real from the air. Every night, fake convoys of headlights moved eastward, their vehicles nothing more than bicycle lamps mounted on poles, operated by soldiers moving in sequence. Opposite these phantoms, German artillery expended thousands of shells on targets that did not exist. Meanwhile, the real bridgeheads were established under cover of smoke and silence miles away. The pattern had become familiar deception, clearing the path for the real to pass unseen. But deception's last triumph came not from military trickery, but from psychological warfare. As Germany's collapse accelerated, British and American propaganda teams, many of them trained by veterans of the London Controlling Section, turned their talents toward breaking morale. They flooded the Reich with forged documents, fake orders, and counterfeit newspapers, claiming entire divisions had surrendered. Some of these operations, under code names like Conflake and Skyman, blurred the line between intelligence and theatre. Aircrews dropped mailbags full of fabricated letters supposedly written by despairing German soldiers, while others broadcast radio stations that mimicked the Reich's own frequencies, inserting false news of disaster into genuine reports. In one such broadcast, transmitted from a converted truck outside Aachen, a British officer posed as a Berlin announcer, calmly stating, "The Führer has ordered strategic withdrawal from the west to form a new line near the Elbe." Within hours, German field commanders were sending frantic messages to confirm the order that never existed. Even in its death throes, the Reich remained vulnerable to suggestion. At SHAEF headquarters, deception planners watched the end approach with a strange melancholy. Their offices, once alive with the feverish energy of imagination, now seemed hollow. Colonel Bevan, who had orchestrated Bodyguard, prepared his final report. He wrote simply, "The deception war is concluded. The enemy's strategic mind was fixed upon illusion. The purpose of Bodyguard has been fulfilled beyond expectation." Yet Bevan added a quiet warning. "The techniques that have served us so well in war," he noted, "will in peace become something else, a habit of the mind, a way of shaping truth itself." He understood what few others did, that deception, once unleashed, does not end when the guns fall silent. After the war, as Europe rebuilt itself, many of the deception officers returned to civilian life, artists to their studios, actors to the stage, engineers to their drawing boards. Some were recruited again, this time into the secret world of Cold War intelligence. Their methods, misinformation, phantom armies, controlled narratives would evolve into new forms: propaganda campaigns, psychological operations, disinformation cells. The ghosts of 1944 would walk again, under new names. For a time, though, those who had crafted the illusions of D-Day gathered in quiet reunions in pubs, airfields, and seaside towns. They spoke little of glory, but much of irony. One RAF officer recalled standing on the cliffs of Dover, months after the invasion, watching the tides roll in where his phantom fleet had once sailed. "We never fired a shot," he said, "but we made the Germans fire thousands. That was our war ghosts against guns." In the archives of the Imperial War Museum today, among crates of tattered maps and faded blueprints, there survives a small, soot-stained model of a cow built from papier-mâché, its hollow belly lined with black paint to absorb light. Its catalogue label reads simply, "Camouflage, Experimental, 1943. To a passerby, it might look like a relic of absurdity, but to those who know its story, it represents the heart of an idea that imagination, properly weaponized, could shape history as surely as any bomb or bullet. The war of deception ended as it began in silence, in the spaces between what was seen and what was believed. And when peace returned to Europe, the fields that once bore straw men and wooden tanks grew green again. But beneath them, in the memory of nations and the whisper of archives, the harvest of ghosts endured proof that even in an age of steel and science, victory could still belong to those who mastered the art of the unreal.